Hello and welcome back to another Portworx Lightboard session. My name is Ryan Wallner, and today we're going to be talking about storage policies. So a storage policy in Portworx is something that helps you define exactly the parameters and attributes that a volume should be configured with by default, or by referencing a storage policy. Now, this isn't to be confused with a storage class or even a default storage class in Kubernetes. What we'll explore is how to set up storage policies in Portworx, and then how you can use them in Kubernetes for how to define sort of the way that PVCs and PVs get created with those attributes automatically using Portworx. So we're going to use a development cluster, a production cluster, and sort of a default policy to talk about in reference to using storage policies. So these names reference the types of storage policies and their name. So in Portworx, you can use the pixie-cuddle CLI utility to define what is a default storage policy. We might say by default, we want the replication to be 2. And that's all we might say for default. If you didn't specify a replication level when you create a volume, we're going to say that it should be 2, meaning that it gives you some high availability, but not the max, but it gives you better than a single replica, unless you want to specifically use 1 replica. Now, in development, we might exactly want 1 replica. Why? Because it's development. We don't necessarily need highly available services. If things go down, fine, we can spin them back up or recover them over time. Things aren't business critical in development. We also, in development, care maybe a little bit more about our data. So we may want a snapshot of once a day. So this allows us to, by default, set up any volume that gets created in development to have at least 1 snapshot a day. And we can say that we want to keep 1 snap, meaning that by default, we keep 1 snapshot. So the next day when it takes another one, it replaces that one instead of keeping multiple snapshots that you could restore to. This may or may not work great. You could have a CI pipeline that really wants more snapshots to kind of test multiple versions of data. In that case, maybe there's a staging policy that you could set up for Portworx as well. But for this use case and explanation, this works pretty well. Then in production, we want high availability. So we want to say that the minimum is replication of 2, meaning that when a volume gets created, it should at least have a replication level of 2, if not 3. We also want to snapshot every 60 minutes, and we want to keep 10 of them, meaning we care more about our data and that we should snapshot more often in case things go wrong. We could also set something like sticky to on, which basically means it's much harder to accidentally delete a volume in production, which is a good thing. So this could be our development cluster and our production cluster. Now, in development, we could say, let's set up this storage policy, and in production, let's set up this storage policy. So by default, any application that uses a volume will get these if we tell our Portworx layer to use these by default. So you can create storage policies, but then you have to set what is the default. So in development, it probably makes sense to have the default storage class point to dev and the production storage class set to production. Now, what would you use default for? Well, say you wanted some level of default capability and the cluster is sort of a mixed environment, you could just set this as a default to say, this is exactly what an application will get. And the nice part about this is, and this is where it sort of ties into Kubernetes, is that in Kubernetes there's something called a storage class. And that storage class may define something like, hey, I want this storage class to use Portworx, and we could set the file system, the IO priority, and these are different from the things that we defined in our development or default storage policy. But if we use this one to create a volume, and Portworx has the default storage class set to, say, default with replication level of 2, this will also get the attribute of REPL 2, meaning that it sort of inherits what should be used by default. The other nice part about using the storage policies mixed with Kubernetes is that in Kubernetes, you also, like we talked about here, have storage classes, but Kubernetes lets you set what the default storage class to be used should be. And in this case, we want to make sure that any volume in our production cluster uses storage policy, and this can be set in the storage class for Portworx to prod. So you just say in the storage class that uses Portworx as the provisioner, you just set storage policy equals prod and set that to be the default storage policy, and it will automatically inherit what is considered production. Now, the nice part about why you do this instead of just setting them all inside the storage class in Kubernetes is it sort of hides the details of what's actually in there, so an administrator can come in at the storage layer and manipulate these. The other thing is these can all be protected by role-based access control. So a storage policy in Kubernetes can have the admin group have write access to the storage policies, but Portworx users with access to the APIs and things like that could have read-only access. And this is kind of important when you don't want, these attributes to change what is kind of the defining factors for your data and to some level, the data protection you're getting at the cluster level for production. So just to recap, storage policies kind of give you the ability to set a standard set of attributes for a volume. And you can use these in Kubernetes by passing the storage policy attribute in a storage class that chooses one of these. Now you can set the default storage class to use this, or as well, you can set at the Portworx level with pixie-ctl to use a default storage policy. Hopefully that makes sense. And until next time, take care.